Hello, everybody. This is Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. In this podcast, we call Green Socialist Notes. It's about continuing to organize and educate around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. And today, I'm not going to have any comments up front because I have a special guest. I'm in Chicago at the Socialism 2022 conference. One of the reasons I came is because our guest is giving a workshop here on Ukraine. And fortunately, I ran into her this morning and got her onto the podcast because I think it's crucial that the Greens and the left and the peace movement in the United States hear from what the Ukrainians are saying, particularly our comrades on the political left there, about what's going on. So what we're going to do is go through a resolution that's before the Green Party National Committee. They're going to start voting on Monday. And I want Yuliya to give her perspective. So our guest is Yuliya Yurchenko. She's a Ukrainian socialist, I would say eco-socialist from talking to her earlier. She's a professor or lecturer in political economy at the University of Greenwich in the UK. Although she's back in Ukraine, I know she's been back during this conflict. She's the author of a book that I think is the most detailed account of how we got to where we're at. It's called Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketization to Armed Conflict. And you can get it from Pluto Press. Came out in 2018 and really goes through, how capitalism, both East and West, has affected the development of Ukraine, the formation of their capitalist class, or she calls them oligarchic class fractions, because they got beefs with each other as well as with the workers, about how the Ukrainian working class has developed, and then just social perspectives on how Ukraine got to where it is and what the future might hold. So she's written that book, and I think that's all I need to say. So Yuliya, welcome, and thank you for coming on. And
thank you so much for having me here.
And we're going to put the link to the text in the chat so people can see it. But maybe we should start, at the conclusion of this resolution, which says the U.S. should stop sending arms to Ukraine, should stop sanctions against Russia, and call for a ceasefire negotiations. So maybe you could comment on that from the viewpoint of a Ukrainian and particularly a socialist in Ukraine.
Well, thank you for having me here to discuss this this motion and these important elements of it and conclusions indeed. Not least, I'm grateful to be able to discuss this with you because this motion and the politics and their implications that underpin this kind of motion and thinking are present across other spectrums of international left, and not only, and they go beyond certain political squabbling, if you like, but rather the consequences of such political positions literally cost lives as we speak. So I'll go through them one by one. The call for the ceasefire is something that we hear a lot from all sorts of sides of political spectrum, and the meaning of that ceasefire changes as this war progresses. I want to remind our listeners, viewers, that there has already been a ceasefire in place before the 24th of February between Russia and Ukraine, because this war is in its ninth year by now. It's 8.5 years old, right? It started with the Russia annexing Crimea and intervening militarily in Donbass. And what we know by now is that there are a lot of verified accounts that Russia has been planning that invasion for many years before. The issues of so-called Novorossiya and Ruski Mir have been permeating local Russophone press in Crimea and Donbass and the south of Ukraine for years preceding that initial invasion. But let's come back to the most recent one. So there was already ceasefire in place, negotiated in 2015, and some may have known about it as the main sort of postulates of that ceasefire were stipulated in what became known as Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. Some of us on the Ukrainian left have thought that once that ceasefire has been negotiated, that now we can negotiate with Russia what to do in Donbass and what to do in Crimea. And as long as no more lives suffer, no more lives are lost, we can continue with this peaceful way of resolving the conflict. I have frozen.
I can see you're still moving.
Oh, okay. So this is just my screen. Okay. So as long as we believed that as long as no human lives are lost, we can continue negotiating and figuring out what to do in this complicated situation that emerged after what became known as the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2013-14. Yet, what we have seen in February this year, Putin and his regime had something else in mind. Years of negotiations have ended up not in the more reinforced and stable ceasefire or some sort of progress in how to resolve the disputes between the countries. And I'm not comfortable with this terminology, disputes, but let's leave it there for now. But rather, we have seen the reluctance on Putin's side to and increased aggression towards Ukraine in his writing and his speeches, in a refusal to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign country and as a political subject in its own right, refusal to recognize Ukrainians as a political nation in their own right. And by now, we have seen since this infamous speech that Putin issued last summer, complete negation of Ukraine as an entity in its own right. And if Ukrainian government and Russian government have such contradictory, in essence, in principle, and in meaning, understandings of what is on stake when those hypothetical negotiations are to happen, then no ceasefire can be agreed. Ukraine is a sovereign country with its borders recognized in 1991, signed and recognized internationally, including by Russia. That those borders have been violated repeatedly by Russia, who does not recognize Ukraine's right to exist anymore. So even if we are to bring Ukraine and Russia to some hypothetical utopian ceasefire, they can never agree on what those conditions can be. Also, we have seen repeated refusal of Russia to try to negotiate. So at this point, I think talking about ceasefire is something that is more of a utopia than anything else. On top of it, if you look at the record of the war crimes, genocidal rhetoric and genocidal actions of Russia in Ukraine, including almost 600,000 children having been kidnapped and stolen from their families to taken to Russia to indoctrinate and turn into Russians. Hundreds of thousands of people's lives destroyed, tens of millions of people displaced. I do not understand how there can be a moral case made for a ceasefire in this situation. There is also the we hear frequently conversations about needing to get to peace. So ceasefires can be agreed when there is a will for peace on either or ideally both sides of the conflict. And what we see now is that there isn't such will. There isn't a will for a peaceful resolution of this war, specifically on the Russian side, because if Russia wanted peace, it wouldn't have started the war to begin with. There is also a dimension to our conversations and ruminations about how to achieve that peace is that there is a path to peace that we can discuss before the war started, and there is an idea of how to achieve peace after the war has started. And I think a lot of the conversations about ceasefire and peace still revolve around the perception. They still haven't moved on with the fact that the war is going on. They still are talking as if we're ad bellum rather than in bellum. And that's why they end up having some sort of circular logic to them, if you like. No, not logic, but circular dynamic to them, as in there isn't any practical steps that kind of people who propose that kind of argument have. In terms of arms supply, I find that the wording of the motion is quite unfortunate, because it says that there needs to be a stop to the unconditional armament of Ukraine. Well, first of all, I'm confused as to what is being called for here. First of all, there is no such thing as unconditional armament of Ukraine. There are dozens and hundreds of conditions as to which arms are supplied, in what amounts, where they can be used, how they can be used, by who, and so on and so forth. So there is no such thing as unconditional supply of arms. Then this kind of wording makes me think, so are there then conditions under which it's okay to supply arms? So as far as I understand, and I'm by no means a military expert, but I listen to enough of them to make an informed conclusion, the arms that have been supplied to Ukraine in no means equip Ukraine to actually fire deep into Russian territory. Also, the United States have been very careful in terms of what kind of arms they supply to Ukraine, so that those supplies are not interpreted as direct NATO involvement and a provocation, so to speak, the word that's so favored by Russia. So that those supplies cannot be interpreted as that kind of provocation. So I think that we need to be careful about what is meant when we talk about arms supplies. There is also a moral and a political element to arms supply to Ukraine. First of all, it's a principle of the left. It's a feminist principle. And it's an ecological principle that those under attack have a right to self-defense. There is, in every conflict, especially in a military conflict, in a war, there is a party that in an imperialistic war, which this one is, because the Russian war on Ukraine is a war of imperialistic grab. It's a neo-colonial war. It's a neo-Nazi attack on on Ukraine as a political subject. What we see is that in this kind of situation, it's very clear who started the invasion and who is being attacked. And Ukraine is being attacked by a country that is significantly more militarily advanced, that has much bigger army, much more arms. Not only that, Russia, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, because Ukraine did disarm in mid-90s, Russia was one of the countries that was supposed to guarantee the sovereignty of Ukrainian borders. And then it went and invaded it twice in the last 8 years. So yes, Ukraine has a right to self-defense, including by help with military supplies from countries who have become guarantors of its sovereignty and its borders integrity. And that included United Kingdom and United States. So in terms of legal obligations, including beyond the disarmament agreement, the army in Ukraine is perfectly within the remit of what is right to do. On top of that, of course, there are UN charters, there are political principles on the left, there are green political principles, feminist political principles, that countries have a right to self-defense. Ukraine does not have enough arms of its own to defend itself against imperialistic neo-colonial aggression of Russia, and therefore it needs to be supplied with weapons so it can defend itself. We see what Russia has been doing in the territories that it occupied in 2014. In some parts of Donbass and Crimea, we have seen ecocide, we have seen deindustrialization, we have seen destruction of labor movements. We have seen harassment of political activists, imprisonment, torture, you name it, it was there. This is what now Russia is bringing to newly occupied territories as well. And the torture camps and the war crimes that Russia is perpetuating in occupied territories are enough in their own right to justify supply of weapons to Ukraine. And last but not least, the question of sanctions. Sanctions must be applied to Russia. But what I think is important to differentiate here, and this is where I think those of us who are in the workers' movement, including eco-socialist movements and green movements, find a bit difficult to wrap our heads around, is that sanctions, indiscriminate sanctions on certain sectors of economy, can, of course, directly or indirectly influence the working class. And this is where I think some disagreements arise from. To that end, I think I think sanctions should apply to countries who perpetuate military aggression. Yet I do think that sanctions could have been much better structured and class differentiated, so that they would punish oligarchs, state apparatchiks, and the military functionaries of Russia who are actually directly responsible for unleashing this war. I do think that solidarity with Russian workers should be built, and there needs to be support for those who are put in destitution through the disruption of Russian economy. Yet the biggest enemy of the Russian workers is the Putinist regime, who has been oppressing and robbing and deindustrializing and disempowering and oppressing the Russian workers, destroying Russian environment, throwing under the bus survival of tundra, not bothering to put out the fires, not putting any environmental preventative measures. Russia now is burning tens of millions of dollars worth of gas daily, just so that they could use gas supplies to Europe as blackmail and as leverage in the resolution of this war that Russia has unleashed. So I think there is a lot to unpack here, but I do think that sanctions need to be upheld. I do think that arms need to be supplied, and conditions are already there. And if your party is interested in having more conditions as to what kind of arms and where should be supplied, then that should be spelled out more clearly. And in terms of ceasefires and peace negotiations, well, I think the most progressive thing that any political force can do is to listen to what Ukrainian workers' movement, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian left and ecological movements and feminist movements are saying in terms of what kind of support and solidarity they want. And what Ukrainian workers want, and workers in Russia would benefit from, and workers in Donbass and in Crimea, is kicking Russia out of Ukraine. That's what needs to happen.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of this resolution, which I think the link to it has been put in the chat so people can look at it. And as background, it starts off right away. It says, because the United States is fighting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine. You know, let's just stop right there. You know where I first heard that from was Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia. He wanted to define this as a U.S. attack on Russia, even though Russia's bombing Ukraine and NATO and U.S. are not bombing Russia. And the Ukrainians are reduced to pawns. They're proxies, according to this. And after I heard it from Lavrov, I started hearing it from the far-right Republicans. Marjorie Taylor Greene was tweeting that same phrase. And, you know, for the Green Party to start off with that assumption is, I guess, embarrassing is the nicest word I can put on it. But, you know, would you like to address that, Yuliya? Because that's what we hear. You know, it's like the Ukrainians are out of it. It's this geopolitical analysis that leaves the people who are most affected out.
Thank you. Indeed, this is quite problematic, to put it mildly, statement. we have heard these dismissive statements about other conflicts, but I'm not going to go there now. To say to me, when I hear that this is a proxy war, that Russo-Ukrainian war is a proxy war between Russia and NATO, first, a couple of things come to mind. First thing that comes to mind is that that kind of viewpoint is sadly too familiar, and in the sense that it expresses the kind of neo-imperialistic sentiment that does not recognize the subjectivity nor the agency of so-called lands and peoples in between. There are core imperial cores, and there are so-called spheres of interest, and whatever is in between is somehow, again, is those kind of pawns, as if it's not people who are living in those lands with their own lives and minds and desires, and yes, subjectivity, and yes, agency. So that is a kind of neo-imperialistic view that disregards and dismisses the subaltern, that dismisses any kind of anti-imperialistic struggle as somehow inferior to the centers of imperialistic core and imperialistic cores. What also comes to mind is that this position is historically inaccurate, and also rather empirically ignorant. NATO membership for Ukraine has not been on the cards. Indeed, there were other countries in the region who have joined NATO, and somehow Russia didn't start invading them or threatening them with a war. The Baltic countries, for example, Poland. Right now, now as a result of the most recent invasion into Ukraine, Finland, who was always a very peculiar case, who appeased Russia by having a special status militarily, internationally speaking. Now Finland is joining NATO, and yet somehow Russia is not going to war with Finland, even though the pretext for invasion to one of the many, and they change every day, there is a new salad of reasons that Russia comes up with as to why they invaded Ukraine. So the narrative from Lavrov and Putin and Medvedev and a bunch of other US state politicians, Russian state politicians, was that they don't want to have NATO missiles on their borders. Well, you already have them in other countries, so why all of a sudden Ukraine, who's not even a member? Another thing that people like Lavrov throw around is that NATO has been pumping weapons into Ukraine, and that's why they invaded now. Well, let's think about this. So first of all, the time frame here is very important. First of all, this whole narrative of NATO pumping weapons into Ukraine is false. There have been some minor supplies, and there has been some trainings done on invitation of Ukrainian party after the initial invasion of 2014, not before. And those were so minor and so insignificant that it's laughable to even talk about them. Next, first of all, NATO themselves have, even when Ukraine, before the first invasion, some Ukrainian politicians voiced aspirations for potential NATO membership. The clear message from NATO was that no, this would be too risky. This is not on the table. We would cooperate, but full membership, forget about it. On top of that, when surveys were conducted in Ukraine on whether the general population would want to see the country in NATO, and that kind of thing needs to be put to national referendum according to Ukrainian constitution, the majority of people didn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO. So it's a complete fiction that Ukraine was somehow going to become a NATO member, and therefore Russia had a reason to kind of stop that from happening. There is also, a kind of a funny point to make here. If I really hope that never happens, but if Russia had succeeded with its idea of taking over Ukraine altogether, well, then they would be on the border with Poland, who is a NATO member, so they would have actually brought the NATO border closer to them. So it's just this is circular logic that doesn't make any sense. But the support for NATO and NATO membership only went up in Ukraine after Russia invaded. So there are, again, jokes running in Ukraine that the grand strategist, quote unquote, Putin is the biggest recruiter for NATO in Central Eastern Europe, because without him, a lot of countries wouldn't have joined. So that whole kind of narrative that NATO somehow is responsible for starting this, especially most recent war, is absolute nonsense. On top of that, I think it is very important that we pay attention actually to what Putin himself says, and he has made a number of he has made a number of speeches on the subject in his 20 years of being in power. That's how democratic Russia is. And he's very clear that, especially in this very telling letter of last July, that NATO sort of is there, but specifically what he's engaged in is restoring what he refers to as Russian historic lands, meaning restoration of Russian Empire. He wants to correct the mistake, as he calls it, that Lenin allowed to happen by creating, quote unquote, contemporary Ukraine. So in that sense, again, quote unquote, Putin wants to decommunize Ukraine, so remove the legacy of the Soviet Union, which is creation of Ukraine and its current borders after the dissolution of Russian Empire as a political subject, and restore it under his own rule. So he's in the project of reconstruction of Russian Empire. And he said it himself a number of times that without Ukraine, there wouldn't have been Russian Empire. So this is his mission. NATO was a pretext. Oh, on top of that, it's very important. It's very clearly stated in the statutes of NATO that no country that is in a state of territorial dispute can join NATO. Ukraine in 2014 already was in the state of territorial dispute. So the risk of Ukraine becoming a NATO member in 2020 is a joke.
It should be coming up in the chat soon. There's a group called Just Security, which has made a compendium of all the things Putin, as well as other Russian leaders have said about destroying Ukraine as an independent state and Ukrainians as a distinct people and nationality. I mean, under the Geneva definition of genocide, the Nuremberg, I guess it's the Geneva Convention on Genocide.
Geneva Convention on Genocide Prevention.
Yeah. These statements are statements of intent to commit genocide in Ukraine. And, people got to listen to what Putin's actually saying. We always say in this country, when the fascists speak like Trump, believe them, because they did what they said they would do. We got to do the same thing with Putin. And that's a track record. If you look at that compendium, goes back to the early 2000s. And since the invasion of Ukraine and the expansion of the invasion of Ukraine in 2024, there's a lot of people. Russian state media is full of this propaganda. So at one point, Yuliya said, which I think people need to take to heart, isn't it a colonialist or imperialist mentality, to listen to what Russia says and what the US says, NATO says, but not what the people in Ukraine say, as if they're just pawns in this thing, calling it a proxy war, as I pointed out. Everybody from Lavrov to Marjorie Taylor Greene and those extremists in the Republican Party are calling it. So maybe we should go to some of the questions in the chat, because we're not going to have time to go through this whole resolution, and and Yuliya gives thorough answers. So we could go on more than the hour we have allotted. But I think there's some questions in the chat that in a way are like, as far as I'm concerned, devil's advocates questions. So I just saw this one. Well, let me ask this one and have you respond, Yuliya. Doesn't Russia know that the US and NATO knows that Russia is sensitive about its borders, going back to history where Russia was invaded frequently? Seems to have a built-in excuse for bad behavior.
Right. Can you repeat the second part? So, like, Russia is sensitive about its borders. Yeah.
It's on your
What
screen.
about this? What about this excuse? Sorry, can you repeat that last bit?
The question's on your screen. I think he's saying Russia has been invaded many times, so they have a built-in excuse for bad behavior toward their neighbors. They need a buffer, a sphere of influence, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, Russia has invaded its neighbors a number of times. No country becomes that size through natural expansion. I can tell you that. And for sure, Russia didn't become that. Kievan Rus, the precursor of what became later Belarus, and to some extent Russia, existed for centuries before Moscow was even founded. And then through a lot of infighting and, hundreds of years of history, I do invite you to take a look at it. Russian Empire has been constructed, and it has submerged a chunk of what constitutes now Ukraine, including the free Cossack state in the steppes of contemporary Ukraine. Ukraine had a history of democratic statehood before Russian Empire encroached on its territory. And Russia cannot live with that very easily. So because a big chunk of Ukraine was under Russian imperial rule, there is in the collective consciousness of Russia, and I specifically say Russia rather than Russian Federation, because there are a lot of regions of Russia that do not quite share, peoples of the regions of Russia who indeed themselves have been colonized by Russia, do not quite share that kind of imperialistic outlook, because they also are treated like second-rate citizens by ethnic Russians, whatever that means. So that kind of imperial colonial legacy has not quite been dealt away with during the Soviet times. The sense of superiority, the fact that Russian was lingua franca in USSR, that kind of sense of entitlement to the territories of what previously was Russian Empire has not quite been rooted out of the psyche of the Russian state. And it has been reinvigorated and weaponized by Putin's regime through creating this kind of discursive history salad by merging elements of Russian imperialist might and Stalinism and some sort of historical mission and Eurasianism, you name it, it's there. And it's complete non sequitur, as any historian of the region will tell you. Any historian who is true to archives rather than redacted versions of KGB files. So this kind of sensitivity about borders is, I'll flip this on its head. Ukraine has been invaded through its history dozens of times, a century. We're also a tad sensitive about our borders, and yet Ukrainians today are being told to embrace their invading brothers and try to negotiate peace with them, even though those so-called brothers keep invading Ukraine without end, keep trade wars, energy blackmail, supporting military suppression of uprisings like in 2013 and 14, you name it. And we are being told that we need to love our oppressor and that we are Russophobes for not loving those soldiers who are coming in to kill our children and rape anybody who comes our way and blow up our houses, schools, and theaters. This is a completely, this is a colonial logic, a kind of reiteration of colonial entitled narratives to say that Russia is sensitive about borders, so we should let it be whatever it is. This also goes against any post-colonial scholarship and right to self-determination and right to fight against oppressor. Appeasement of an abuser is only going to embolden an abuser. There are international rules and rights and agreements. Russia itself has recognized Ukraine's borders. You cannot have such fundamental disregard for sovereignty of your neighbors while waving in everybody's face a kind of a self-made papier-mâché history book of your own country and entitlement to all the lands you feel sensitive about. This is a completely propagandistic narrative.
Okay. Here's a question. Why does Ukraine accept Nazis into its fold? And do you have any updates on the fates of Black and brown-skinned people caught up into this conflict trying to get out?
Okay. I think this is an important question because this is something that's often been used to justify not supporting Ukraine's resistance against the war of imperialistic aggression. So first of all, we need to differentiate there. I know that very often people make references here to the infamous Azov Battalion. So Azov Battalion in 2014 and Azov Battalion in 2022 are two completely different organizations. That's for one. It is not a self-organized battalion with some extreme right-wing ideology anymore. It's a significant. They have significantly. There are some members of them who were the main proponents of extreme right-wing ideology who have been distanced from Azov. The majority of Azov, as all other volunteer battalions that were formed in 2014 to go and fight Russian invasion in Donbass, have been since submerged into Ukrainian army as part of bringing them under the control of the rule of the military, so that they are subject to the command from the Ministry of Defense. Any violation from command, and they're subject to a tribunal. So that was one way of dealing with these militaristic groups that sprung up in 2014, which I think, if you think about this, it was probably one of the more pragmatic solutions to it. There were some more outright right-wing groups that were more tolerated in some occasions when Poroshenko was president, and that has been. There have been some cases of right-wing violence in the streets that sometimes have been dropped and not properly prosecuted. There were those cases, and it's important to acknowledge that they existed before even this latest invasion. Yet we need to also understand the proportion of this problem. So these groups are quite marginal. They do not have any significant political influence. They can sometimes be used as proxies, if you like, domestically for some rivalries between different economic or political groups. But if you look at the kind of the significance of them overall in the political life of the country, they are quite more marginal than similar groups in the United States, significantly more marginal. There are some arguments being launched when an explanation like what I've just given to you is being said, that, oh, well, they may not be numerous, but then, there is a lot of right-wing sentiment in Ukrainian mainstream politics. Well, I'll just tell you this one thing. In 2014, in the middle of the war in Donbass, there was a parliamentary election where none of the right-wing parties scrabbled enough votes to get seats in the parliament on the party lists. That's a country in the middle of a war that is the pretext of which is the denial of national identity. At the same time, we have outright nationalist fascist parties like AfD and Marine Le Pen parties sweeping dozens of seats in their respective parliaments. So when we think about the problem of the far right and the degree to which their ideas permeate the national psyche, we need to be careful the weight that we assign and the significance that we assign to them. A lot of the narrative around Ukrainian nationalists is also tainted by the narratives that come out of Russian propaganda, that Ukraine, any sort of national movement that has to do with Ukrainian national identity, and I also have to say that Ukrainian nationalist movements, nationalist sentiments, they most frequently are centered around civic nationalism rather than ethno-nationalism. So it's very important to make that differentiation. Ukrainian President Zelensky now, he was a Russian-speaking Jew who was elected after Poroshenko, who was going to the election with his slogan, "Army, Faith, and Nation." There is a popular rejection of that kind of nationalist militarism in Ukraine. There is also recognition, there needs to be also recognition that when a country is in a state of war, the current war, where its own existence is being denied and it's not being recognized as a subject in its own right, there may be an upsurgence of some sort of reactionary nationalism with some conspicuous expressions, such as people wearing traditional clothes, for example. But that is, again, that is more on the level of signaling that, yes, we had a history, yes, we have an identity separate from yours. It's not a nationalism that's trying to say that it's superior than others. It's not nationalism that's trying to invade other countries. It's simply a right to exist on your own land and decide how to be there on your own terms. In terms of, there were references to non-white people in Ukraine, and I suspect the reference was made to the initial weeks of invasion when people were trying to cross the border into Poland, for example, and there were some ugly scenes, to put it mildly, at the border crossing. Well, I can tell you from some witness accounts of people who were queuing at the same time and who were helping as volunteers at the crossings. So there were, some of it is basically really kind of ugly contingency, if you like. So when the invasion started, Poland opened its border to Ukrainian refugees. And how they did it, they said anybody with any Ukrainian passports come in. They didn't open the border right away to anybody with also a right to remain in Ukraine, right? So that created tensions for the border guards, right? So who were told, they have a category of who they are allowed to let in and who they are not allowed to let in. They were not individually discriminating at the border of who to let through, who not. Next thing, there were cases where, especially in the first days, people were queuing for days on foot, in cold, in the end of February, on the border crossing. And mainly it was elderly women with young children. The majority of non-white people who were trying to cross the border were foreign students in Ukraine. There is, since Soviet times, there is tradition with what used to be the friendly nations of USSR to send, to have this kind of academic exchange. And of course, there are more countries who send their students to Ukraine now, or other students come. And those are young, fit people. And so the guards were prioritizing letting through women with young babies, because those cannot sleep in the field in the middle of the night as easily as young, fit, without small children. And so some of those clashes that existed on the border, and some of it was messier than I have time to discuss here. Like, so there was a combination of course, I'm not excluding that there may have been some individual cases, some cases of individuals having some xenophobia, maybe even racism, but the majority of it was how the movement through the border was organized procedurally that discriminated people effectively because of their passports on the basis of race then as well, but it was mainly citizenship rather than anything else. And then there was this whole prioritization of who were considered to be the more vulnerable category to go through first. Yeah, so if I understood the question correctly, if there is a separate element to it, please by all means do tell me. I also know in terms of for example, presence of non-white people in Ukrainian armed forces or volunteer movements, that does exist, and I've not come across cases of discrimination or oppression in any specific way. But if you have heard of something, please do bring it to my attention, and I will certainly look into it.
Yeah, I want to get to this question. I want to make sure we get this. How can people stay up and get the news? And I want to put in the chat the link to the group Yuliya belongs to, Socialny Ruk. I probably pronounced that wrong, but it translates into.
It was great. Yeah, it was great.
They have a website that puts out regular statements, as things develop. One of the questions was about the anti-worker legislation Zelensky passed. The social movement opposed that. It did pass. Now it's going to court. The social movement's been working with the unions there on that. And the other thing that will come up is the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, which is a labor movement-based network out of the UK. And they got a lot of statements coming in from not just Ukraine, but from the opposition in Russia and other parts of the world. So the question that was up there was about the US-backed coup in 2014, which is the way most people on the left here think of it, rather than it being, a popular movement where hundreds of thousands of people were out in below zero weather, against corruption, for democracy, and especially against police brutality. I mean, we all have the quote from Victoria Nuland, but what's his name? She said our man is Yats. I forget his name.
Yatsenyuk.
Yeah, and he ended up being prime minister, but that he wasn't elected president. Poroshenko was, and then the parliament made this guy Yats the prime minister. But people think as if, Victoria Nuland snapped her fingers and suddenly the guy's prime minister. So can you talk about 2014 and how it relates to the current time?
Yes, certainly. I think I'm glad this question was asked because it allows me to explain what happened there. I think this, I think Nuland wishes she was so powerful as to, through a couple of conversations, twist the turn of history. If United States politicians and military indeed could have as easily organized everything in the world, we would be looking at a very different situation right now. Russia probably wouldn't have been fighting Ukraine at the moment. Russia would have already been something significantly weaker by now. But world politics and geopolitics are much more complicated than that. Do politicians, including and especially American politicians, try to support different groups that they think would be more advantageous to them to be in power in different countries? For sure. All countries do that, especially the ones who are world hegemons and are trying to hold on to their power. Have they supported groups and helped stage coups in other places in the world? For sure. Yet, what was happening in Ukraine was more complicated than that. It was a popular uprising. So to put it briefly, it was a popular uprising that got hijacked by oligarchs because Putin invaded the country and stole the revolutionary movement. And that kind of external threat allowed oligarchs to hijack the achievements of the popular revolt, which was displacement of Yanukovych. So in 2014, 2013 still, when people went into the streets of what became initially known as Euromaidan protests, the initial presence of people in the street, it wasn't even so much a protest as there were demonstrations of peace and celebration, because Ukraine was about to sign its deep comprehensive free trade agreement, which was like a precursor to association agreement with the EU, and that gave them hope with gave people hope of deeper integration with the EU, and not necessarily because people thought that people were naive to think that all of a sudden all of their problems will disappear, but with closer cooperation and oversight from Brussels, there was a hope of an increased rule of law in the country, where oligarchs and military and security, not so much military, but security forces, customs, police, were kind of having a grab on the country's resources and economy, and were stifling economic development, and were corrupt and were pillaging the country. So there was a hope of some sort of order and oversight and eradication of those ills, political ills that existed in the country. That was going to come with this agreement. Last minute, at a summit in Vilnius, in the late autumn of 2013, Putin puts pressure on Yanukovych, again manipulation with gas prices. He's saying he's going to put prices on gas high, and that will damage Ukrainian high energy intensive industry owned by oligarchs in Donbass specifically, because that's where a lot of heavy industry is concentrated, because that's where a lot of natural resources for it are based. And so Putin twists the arm of Yanukovych and the oligarchs whose industries are in the east of the country. Last minute, Yanukovych doesn't sign this treaty. So a lot of reforms that were put in place in the build up to that, and the socioeconomic inequalities and dispossession that came with that, were justified, but were sold to the population as the hardship we need to go through while we're building a stronger economy. And once we sign this agreement, things will start improving. So the patience of the people was at the boiling point, and there was a lot of protest activity in the build-up in the years before this agreement, because the financial crisis has hit Ukraine really hard. For reasons I can discuss maybe in a different chat with you. So this is when that Euromaidan demonstrations of let's celebrate and sing songs because we'll be in the EU one day turns into a proper anti-regime revolt. You have from a couple of hundred of people singing songs in the squares, you have masses in every city of Ukraine, including Donetsk and including Lugansk, which then Putin pretended wanted his troops in. People were demonstrating against this rejection. They felt tricked, they felt lied to, all sorts of things. So that kind of, and because Yanukovych was at this point in Putin's pocket, so to speak, because he rejected this kind of westwards orientation, any politician who was going to replace him potentially and switch Ukraine back to its Western integration course was going to be favored by US politicians. You do not need a coup for that. It was already like this kind of westwards orientation of Ukraine was on the books before even 2004 when Yushchenko came to power. So it was just, I think, when you hear this narrative, this is basically people looking for fast and ready, quick answers to very complex historical situations. And it was not a coup. It was not a right-wing coup. It was not a coup that was somehow designed by the United States. They wish they had that much power. They don't. Not in Ukraine. You know, they would. If it were for the United States this time around, they would have wanted Ukrainians to allow Russia come in so that there wouldn't be a geopolitical crisis, the biggest one since the Second World War. But we have it on hand because Ukrainians want to fight. Nobody's telling them to fight. They want to have a better life for themselves. And they were tired first time of oligarchic regime. Now they're still tired of oligarchic regime, but they need to kick the enemy out of the territory of Ukraine before they can deal with the one inside the country.
Mr. Anderson asks, what is the current situation of the anti-worker bill in Ukraine? Can it be stopped immediately? What is the situation for improving rights? Yeah, I spoke to that, but you want to add to it, where we're at with that?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question because I'm part of the Socialist, Democratic Socialist organization in Ukraine, and I'm part of the London rooted but spread across the UK Ukraine Solidarity campaign. So we do a lot of work around this campaigning. So this bill has been passed, and now we were campaigning against it's being signed and put into place, and now we're campaigning to get it revoked. So this bill effectively strips of most rights of all workers in small and medium enterprises, and that is the majority of Ukraine's working population. So the consequences are catastrophic. Right, that's on top of everything else that the workers had to endure in this last few years, and especially in the last 6 months. So this, the association agreement, not the association agreement, the the candidate member state is with the EU is giving the campaigners like my organization, armory, if you like, in fighting to revoke this bill, because it goes against not just ILO recommendations, because with recommendations you can do a lot of things, as we know from around the world, but there is the EU Working Time Directive, there are EU regulations around the social dialogue that is engaging different stakeholder groups in what and trade unions in how workers' rights are being negotiated and protected. And also there are a lot of other protections around pay, time, remuneration, pension, and safety in the workplace that exist in the framework of the European Union directives, and that gives us something to fight against. So we can call bluff, or rather, we can call bullshit. Excuse my French on this government, on Zelensky government's European aspirations, if they're actually going against what is enshrined in the EU law as protections of workers' rights. Of course, EU protections of workers' rights are imperfect. You know it, I know it. There are a lot of problems there, but they are better than what Ukraine has got on the table now. So this candidacy status now gives us a bargaining chip, if you like, to the campaigners, and we're ramping up publicity and doing a lot of campaigning now around trying to revoke that bill. And I'm very hopeful that we can get that done, not least because the biggest trade unions of Ukraine are also on our side, and they're lobbying through the international associations that they're part of.
Steve Talbot, Russia started the war in Ukraine during the COVID crisis, a supply chain crisis, US racial crises, right-wing ascendancy worldwide. Did Russia believe these factors would hamper US intervention? I have an opinion on that, but I'll let you go first, Yuliya.
Probably. I think quite the thing is, it's always a bit of an ungrateful business trying to guess what Russia thought. But if we are to look at the patterns of the behavior and the so-called diplomacy at war that Russia is using, then yes, for sure. We have seen the manipulations and the blackmail around grain supply, threat of the world hunger, that they were not too squeamish to use. Now they're threatening us with the major catastrophe at the biggest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. They're turning off the gas on Europe, threatening everybody with freezing in winter. So I'm guessing yes. I'm guessing yes. Again, like, I haven't seen the memos, but it is perfectly within the pattern of their behavior, for sure. And also, imagine, like, for all of these kind of international support for Ukraine or any country in the state of a disaster, if money has to come out, when United States are paying for sending aid to Ukraine, that is the money that is something that especially the Conservative Party, Republican Party, excuse me, the same thing, can say, oh, this is the money that could have been used in the United States, and that of course alienates and upsets certain voters, and because they see it as money that's taken away from them. So in that sense, it would have been more difficult to get popular support for assistance for a country in crisis. And we see those kind of manipulations all around. And that's also within the remit of how fascist right-wing governments work. You create this kind of cleavages and undermine popular support so that you can play more roughly, so to speak. So I would say yes.
Yeah, I don't know what's in Putin's mind, but I look at what he does and not just what he says, although I put that compendium of remarks. I'm really worried that, in this inflationary environment, maybe big recession or depression, there will be scapegoating of Ukrainians who are taking money from people here. The right wing does that, as Yuliya just pointed out. In the US, usually by dog whistles, it's immigrants and black folks and other minorities that are taking stuff from you and then under inflation. So that's why you get a right winger like Marjorie Taylor Greene saying in her tweet where she says, this is a proxy war with Russia. And you go further down, she says, I don't care about Ukrainians. I care about Americans. That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear it. And as this thing goes on, I'm afraid Ukraine is going to lose support because the right wing will come to power. In some of the European countries, Le Pen came very close. The right wing here is much stronger than it is in Ukraine, as Yuliya pointed out, the Republican Party. So that's what I'm worried about, that, they're going to pull support from Ukraine and let Russia, the idea for me, this is my view, the idea we can call for negotiations and suddenly, Russia will say, they're not firing back at us, so we'll stop. That's not going to happen. We got to be realistic. So,
yeah, but they also are now threatening, they're not even talking about stopping in Ukraine. They're talking about going into Poland and bombing London and Paris and Berlin and going into Scandinavia. And they have been, I have bad news for you, they have been talking about nuking the hell out of the United States for quite some time on Russian TV. And as you said it before, when people are threatening to kill you, you got to believe them. You got to take them seriously. And we've seen that Russia doesn't shirk from actually going ahead with those crazy promises. And if you repeat these absolutely outrageous mantras long enough, you start believing them yourself. And that's been the narrative inside Russia for a number of years now. So we need to be very careful with where we lay the blame today.
Amy Sachs, it is taking money away from us. The U.S. has had a bloated military budget my entire life, while it cries that it can't spare anything to save us. Well, I would argue the U.S. military budget can be, and I called for a 75% cut when I was running for president. That would still leave about $200 to $250 billion. And we're committed to really about $25 billion over the years, because, the U.S. number that's always thrown out there is $54 billion. But a lot of that is humanitarian aid, financial aid for Ukraine, whose, fiscal situation is just, it's flat on its back. $5 billion of that was for helping get, food to other parts of the world that are impacted by this war. So, 25 billion, 10% of the military budget to enable the Ukrainians to defend themselves, I think is money well spent. And it does, we can deeply cut the U.S. military budget and still have plenty to provide Ukraine what it needs to defend itself. So, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And, U.S. military budget has been exploded for decades, and very often it was used to militarize city policing inside the United States, which has no justification, sending arms to a country that's in a state of war, that's in a state of being invaded, that that is military expenditure justified. Policing with military heavy-duty vehicles your own citizens, that isn't. But I think the question that that's been raised about money being taken away from everyday Americans, I think it's a very important one, because this is also the voice of frustration that needs to be heard, because that is also the voice that if on the left we do not address, the right will grab. And the thing is that we need to be very, very clear where that money is being taken away from and who is taking that money. Because there are billionaires who have exploded their wealth through the pandemic, when millions of Americans have been destituted, so many lost their lives, so many have lost their livelihoods, while others profiteered, and they probably didn't even pay the dime of tax on that. So it's they who are taken away from everyday Americans. It's people like Jeff Bezos, who is flying to space instead of giving decent toilet breaks to his workers. They are the enemy, because we need to be looking at not specific country politics, which is important, but we need to be looking at the class politics and the political systems in which they are. Because those people, and I'm not talking about the speaker, about the audience member who's asked the question, but specifically about politicians who are trying to weaponize this trope about aid as something that's being taken away from our country and we shouldn't send it somewhere else. I live in Britain and I hear it all the time. It's the same kind of trope. UK Conservative Party and American Republicans, they're twin brothers. And this is, as you said yourself, it's always kind of it's compartmentalizing and blaming the foreigner, the person of color, some immigrant or refugee. That is just to divert attention from the fact that the system is built in a way to leech of the weakest and the most hardworking and the meekest, and enrich the American oligarchy, the international oligarchy. They look at how the sanctions have been applied. All of these Russian billionaires are still on their yachts in the Mediterranean and in Florida. Nobody's going after them. While everyday Russians are actually suffering from sanctions, billionaires are absolutely fine. Some of their assets have been frozen, but they will never be liquidified. Because if you go after one segment of oligarchs of one country, you have to go against the rules that are written for international oligarchy. And that means that they will hit British oligarchs and German oligarchs and American oligarchs, who have been destroying the planet, who have been destroying the infrastructure of the United States. Look at the state in which roads and schools and water utilities are. Look what's going on in Mississippi right now, in Jackson. Flint, what's been going on there? People still don't have decent drinking water. How is that possible in a country as rich as the United States? So I understand the anger of people who feel neglected by their own governments while it's helping somebody else. But I want to redirect that anger where it belongs, at the oligarchic class inside the United States government, who is forfeiting the needs of its own population.
Violet of Content Boutique, do you believe Russia should be permitted to place biolabs and war training camps and bombs in Mexico, Canada? And of course, that is assuming that there are biolabs producing weapons in Ukraine, which Russia has alleged.
There is absolutely no evidence that there has been any biolabs producing weapons in Ukraine. There is absolutely no evidence of that. There have been some labs being put in place to sequence COVID viruses, for example, but there is no evidence of bioweapons at all.
Yeah.
But as a general statement, I would say that no country should be allowed to develop biological weapons.
Yeah, and the other part of that is war training camps and bombs in Mexico, Canada. That's assuming that Ukraine military to defend itself is getting ready to attack Russia. That's
yeah. No, look, this is the narrative that Lukashenko has been using to somehow justify, not that he cares very much, why he allowed Russia from the territory of Belarus to invade Ukraine, because that's the border with Ukraine. Belarus border is the closest bit. It's to Kiev, right? So, like, a tank without a stop, it takes it 24 hours from Belarus to Kiev. But they get overheated if they go non-stop. But that's a separate conversation. This whole narrative that if Russia didn't invade, Ukraine would have invaded. It's absolutely crazy. First of all, Ukraine knows that it's militarily disadvantaged, right? They managed through tactical warfare to hold the front while being outnumbered in terms of personnel and in terms of machinery, arms, artillery, but only because they have kind of home advantage that they're tactically using it. And now they're also getting some arms supplies. If Ukraine were to invade Russia, they wouldn't be getting arms supplies from anyone, so they would have been annihilated within no time. First of all. Secondly, Ukraine and Russia has been in the state of war by the time of the most recent invasion for 8 years. Why would Ukraine, in all of this time, so they negotiated a ceasefire, right? And then in all of this time, why would have Ukraine waited for Russia to accumulate most of its army on its borders to then start invading Russia? It's madness. It makes no sense at all. Ukrainians are a lot of things, but they are not suicidal. So.
Okay, follow-up from Violet. Seems to me that Ukrainians were bullying Russian descent people in the Donbass. Why not just let them go join Russia if they want to?
Because Russia invaded Donbass. Donbass residents never wanted to be part of Russia. There was a staged fake referendum where under the barrel of the gun, there was a fake vote against all procedures. So I will never support that. Should we have had a hypothetical scenario, and that is written in the constitution of Ukraine, that any part of Ukraine has a right to have autonomy through a referendum. That is guaranteed in Ukraine's constitution. And it has to be an overwhelming majority. Indeed, Crimea was an autonomous republic as part of Ukraine before Russia annexed it in 2014. They had their own parliament. They had a high degree of devolution in decision making because that was negotiated, and they also had an all Crimea parliament, and they also had a separate Crimean Tatar government, because they are the indigenous people of Crimea, who Stalin force deported in the state of a couple of weeks, in the course of which hundreds of thousands of people died in the middle of the Second World War. And when Ukraine became independent, it allowed for Crimean Tatars to return and reclaim their ancestral land and settle and make their life on their own terms in Crimea. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, they started hounding Tatars out and grabbing their land, them and Ukrainians. They in Donbass, there was Girkin/Strelkov army, who's now changed his name again and is fighting in Crimea. And there were a couple of stooges who were whipping up this kind of anti-Ukrainian, anti-Banderi, whoever are Banderi in Ukraine, vote, but they were significantly outnumbered before Russian military came in. The majority of local population were part of these Euromaidan protests. There were Ukraine when there was all of this Novorossiya infiltrators all over the southeast Ukraine. Some of the biggest pro-Ukraine with Ukrainian flags demonstrations were held in Donetsk. That was before Russia brought in their army. So these so-called people's republics were an artificial creation with help of Russian military. We need to understand that. Should people of Donetsk or Lugansk Oblast decided that we want to be separate, we do not want to recognize the temporary government in Kiev, which actually has absolutely legitimately constitutionally taken control after Yanukovych fled on his own accord from the country, then people who have been elected members of parliament have taken control over the government. Nobody, and the reason there was this presidential election in May of 2014 is so that Ukraine had a commander-in-chief, because interim government doesn't have a right to wage any military campaign, and there was Russian army in Ukraine at that point. So Ukrainian interim government, whatever is this narrative of, there was a military coup and the right-wingers took control over the government. No, all proper procedures were followed. Before there was an election and people actually elected Poroshenko president, no military campaign was started by the interim government because they didn't have a right, even though they could have had, but they didn't. So we need to be there is a lot of detail here that gets twisted in Russian narratives. But again, I want to remind you that what happened in Donbass can by no means constitute an expression of the will of the people, and in that sense, I cannot recognize it. Should it have been? Absolutely. I believe in the right to self-determination of people. On whatever kind of set of characteristics they decide to choose to identify as a coherent group. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think one thing people don't understand is that before the war broke out in 2014, 60% of the people in Donbass were ethnic Ukrainians. And as Yuliya talked about earlier, what's happened since then? Enormous repression in the occupied territories. Labor unions smashed. They just leveled a lot of cities. The place has been largely depopulated. And even before then, or after the invasion, they had Minsk 1 and 2, which gave some autonomy to the Donbass Oblast, Luhansk and Donetsk. And that all seems to be lost in this narrative. In the lead up to the war, you heard all this statement that Ukraine was bombing the Donbass.
That's a lie.
Yeah, the OSCE was monitoring under the Minsk agreement. There wasn't any bombing going on until they left because they saw the Russian invasion coming. The OSCE monitors left, and people on the ground in Ukraine were saying, yeah, the Russians started bombing the hell out of us as soon as the OSCE left. That's the week before February 24th. And Putin is trying to create this thing that, the Ukrainians are committing genocide in the Donbass. And that's not what happened. And so I know we've gone over the normal time. I know that can you stick around longer, Yuliya, or you got?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this kind of this genocide narrative that Ukraine continued paying pensions and other social security payments to people in those self-proclaimed republics all of these years, regardless. Genocidal countries don't do that kind of thing. That's first of all. Secondly, Russia, there was this kind of support of these so-called, there was this narrative that Russia supports these so-called people's republics and it needs to help them be liberated so that they can finally be free. They're not pushing that narrative anymore. They are saying that they want to conduct another vote so that the Donbass can become part of Russia. So as Kherson, so as Mariupol and other cities in Ukraine. They are not talking about that was a lie and a decoy the whole time. Also, all the way in the meantime, and especially in the build up to the war, Russians en masse were issuing Russian passports to people in these so-called republics, and what they created was a system of socioeconomic segregation, if you like. So those with Russian passports could get decent jobs, they could get some sort of social benefits, and generally it was like a form of an apartheid, if you like. I don't like throwing that word around. Excuse me. I'm just sort of, still a bit jet lagged, so I'm kind of a bit vocabulary struggling. So please forgive me for using that word because it's quite serious. I understand, but there was this, different categories of citizens created, and Russia was issuing these Russian passports. So then again, they can say, well, our citizens are here and they live here, so this is Russia now. So the kind of the construction of this legitimizing narrative that is a soup of fact and fiction. I can understand why people who are not following it all the time get confused, because it is confusing as hell. And I'm trying to follow as much as I can, and I get overwhelmed, because it's very difficult to differentiate sometimes this fact from fiction. And we're better at doing it now, researchers and reporters, because we've been dealing with this for the last 9 years, at least. But for anybody who's not been following it closely, and we all have busy lives, I can understand how all of this is so confusing, overwhelming, and surreal, that it's very difficult to make sense of it. I would very strongly recommend, it's actually quite an easy and kind of unsettling, but easy read. Please take a look at Peter Pomerantsev, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Because that book excellently documents how this kind of alternative reality, if you like, gets constructed in the media spaces of Russia. He's been living and working there for a number of years. He's himself a child of immigrant refugees from USSR. And it's very thorough, and it will help you make sense of the surreal reality that gets constructed in Russian media space and in Russian politics as well. Yes, so did you want to stay for another couple of minutes, or how did you want to do it? We can do it till past, maybe one other.
Yeah, I'm fine with doing that. I think we're just really scratching the surface, given the questions we're getting. We didn't really get through that whole resolution, so let's keep going, and then at 4:30 wrap up. 4:30 Central Time.
Yeah, I'm happy to do a second episode of this, perhaps sometime next week, so that we can dig deeper into some of the questions that your audience may have. Because I understand it's always tricky to make sense of something so complex, so dynamically developing, and also a lot of it can be kind of distant and confusing. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, also in an environment where you've got Russian propaganda and their echoes in our internet ecosystem. You have an understandable reaction to, given the viciousness of U.S. imperialism, at least since the invasion of Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan,
of course,
and many more smaller conflicts that we hardly even know about, that people think, well, if the U.S. is doing it, like army in Ukraine, we got to be opposed to it, without actually looking at what's going on the ground in that situation. So it's understandable, but I think, I definitely would like you back to do this more. Next week, I'm at the Pennsylvania Green Party convention and promised a couple of their people an opportunity to come on. But, maybe the week after, the resolution before the National Green Party will be voted on this week. But I think, this discussion, that's not going to resolve the problem, because if anything, the Green Party is divided on that resolution. So, you can have a vote, and whichever side gets the majority may be able to speak, but the other side is, going to keep speaking. So this discussion will be ongoing. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, thank you for having me on. And I think if this has helped in the slightest for people listening to start like wrapping their head around what excuse me is going on there on the ground, then I'm glad, because it's a horrifying situation, and I know everybody wants it to be over. Believe me, Ukrainians want it to be over more than anyone else. Excuse me. Along COVID, I get these bouts of dry throat.
So the Michael Shin question, I think, is maybe that can be the last one that came up there for a second. I saw an unsourced claim recently that Ukraine and Russia had agreed on a peace a few months ago, but U.S. influence blocked the peace agreement. Yeah, Yuliya rolling her eyes. I've been looking at this because this keeps coming up. What Zelensky proposed at the end of March was, okay, Ukraine will be neutral, non-nuclear, and won't have foreign troops based in it. But that's got to be guaranteed by a treaty, not just the Budapest 94, memo, which, was just a piece of paper. It didn't have the strength of a treaty, signed by, Russia, USA, France, Germany, Turkey, all the big powers, China, and that the situation in Donbass and Crimea should be resolved diplomatically over the next 15 years.
Yeah, which was a great plan, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, that answered Putin's purported geopolitical concerns.
Yeah, and he threw it in the bin.
And it allowed for a democratic resolution of the disputed territory.
Yeah, and it was Russia who threw it in the bin.
That's right. So now at that time, your buddy Boris Johnson in the UK, told Zelensky not to negotiate, but that's like saying, Victoria Nuland dictated what happened in Ukraine. Boris Johnson had his opinion, but
it's this. Yeah, no, exactly. It's like that Victoria Nuland comment. Like, because I've seen there was that piece. Was it Washington Post or something the last week? I can't remember. Yeah, it's again, it's like people seeking extremely simplistic answers to very complex questions. We need to remember the timing. When did Boris Johnson come to Kyiv for the first time? It was about a week or so after Russia withdrew from the north of Kyiv, right? So there are all of these kind of proposals, and Russia realizes they can't take Ukraine, so they try to kind of refocus, as in the whole country, so they kind of regroup and moving their troops around, and they're pulling from the north of Kyiv. And from what I understand, it was really touch and go, especially in the first weeks of war, because Russians were quite deep into Kyiv itself, and the Western forces were advising Zelensky to leave Kyiv and settle government in Lviv and just let Russians take it. It was popular resistance that actually wouldn't let him do it. And in that sense, actually, we joke about this in my activist networks, that for the first time in Ukraine's independent history, we finally have properly representative leadership in the country, where the president is, at least in his foreign policy leadership, is doing what the will of the people is. When he was offered to leave the country to kind of for his own protection, and he famously replied or not that he needs an ammo, not a ride, everybody applauded him that, he is the very strong military leader, and he stayed with his people, and he did, he did, no denying that. But at the same time, we need to understand, should he have left, there wouldn't have been one spot on this planet where Ukrainians wouldn't have found him and avenged him for that, for leaving the country in such a situation. So we actually have the president doing what the popular will is finally, and that actually, when I hear that Johnson is changing the mind and this and that and other. Again, like, we have the echo of all of this, that Ukrainian politicians and people are just these puppets who somebody can whisper something in and things change. It's insulting. It is really, really insulting to hear what happened at the time, all the horrors of what Russians did in the north of Kiev, Bucha, the very infamous case, were there for everyone to see. Mass graves, rapes, torture, raped children. All of that was there for everyone to see. The public outrage was beyond the boiling point. Should have the government conceded in anything to Russia at that point, the troops would have probably killed the government. Or Kievans themselves would. This is my speculation. I'm kind of, you understand that I'm not seriously suggesting that would have happened, but this is just sort of, an illustration of how tense and horrifying things were in Kiev, politically. The horror in which the whole country was when there was evidence of what Russians did. No conceding to Russia could have happened at that point. The fact that maybe Boris Johnson did say something of the kind to Zelensky, I'm not going to confirm nor deny. I wasn't in the room with them, nor was the person who wrote that piece making that suggestion. But what I can tell you is that I was in Ukraine at the time, and I remember, and I was following all sorts of different news outlets, politicians, journalists very closely. No one in their right mind would have sat down to concede anything to Putin at that time, Johnson or not.
Okay, we're past 4:30 Central Time, which is an hour and a half. Is there any last point you'd like to leave people with?
I suppose, to just kind of round up this discussion. I'm glad that there is a lot of interest still in what's going on in Ukraine, because one of the worst things that can happen is people stopping asking questions and trying to figure out what's going on. I do encourage everybody to actually follow Ukrainian sources, and it was already suggested to look at what Ukraine Solidarity Campaign printing, and we do events every once in a while, so follow our website. What the Socialny Ruch are doing. Also, there is a great journal of social criticism called Commons that I do encourage you to look at. There are also more popular but good quality outlets such as Kiev Independent, they're Anglophone. There is Suspilne, and then there is Ukrainska Pravda, that is sort of like a bit of a mix of, your patriotic war at war and very critical coverage. But they do very good quality journalism, and there is a lot of updated coverage, and all of their content is in Ukrainian, Russian, and English. Which also a little point to everybody who says that Russian language and speakers are somehow oppressed in Ukraine. Most press is had to start switching to, or at least like adding some Ukrainian over the last few years, because most of it has always been in Russian. And as a Ukrainian speaker, I used to be bullied in Vinnytsia when I was at school for being from a Ukrainian speaking family, because that was considered to be a language of losers. So that's, again, to you some understanding of language politics in Ukraine, but we can talk about it at a different podcast. What I want to leave you with is that listen to Ukrainian voices, make sure that you're informed on what's going on before you draw any conclusions. It's horrible, it's messy, but we need to build understanding and solidarity and speak directly to each other. If we get narratives from propagandistic oligarch, tycoon-owned media, we will never know quite what's going on. They're interested in pitching us against each other. And what we need to be doing is building solidarities, Ukrainian workers and American workers and Russian workers and French and British and Nigerian and Argentinian all around the world. Only then will we not have resources taken away from us, taken away from our planet and future generations, and going towards mega yachts and mansions, but rather being used responsibly and to support everyone's family, children, themselves, decent work, decent pension, dignity in life, recreation, and healthy air and air to breathe and food to eat. Let's work together and build a better world so that wars like in Ukraine right now, aggression like what we see in Russia, is never to be again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for being on, and I'm sure we're going to continue the discussion going forward. Just going back to where we started, there is a resolution before the National Committee of the Green Party this week. We put the link to it. I urge people to, if you're on the National Committee or know people who are, talk to them, urge them to vote no. You can reject this statement. We can take it back to the drawing board. I think the way it is now is very, divisive within the Green Party. And we need more discussion on this because I think a lot of people haven't heard from voices like Yuliya, who's a Ukrainian socialist. She's speaking for the people of the people who are most impacted. Instead, we're getting messaging about, as if this is purely an inter-imperialist war between, Western imperialism and Russian imperialism, although some people won't even acknowledge Russian imperialism. When the fact is the prime aspect here is a war of national liberation. And there are two traditions that I think this resolution violates. The Green tradition, which going back to the fight against Euro missiles, where the Greens did not take a position east or west, they were against on both sides. And now with these hypersonic missiles, the Russians putting them on their jets or potentially putting them on their jets in Kaliningrad, and the US having them submarines off, they're seconds away from each other. We're in a worse Euro missiles crisis now than we were in the 1980s. But that's where the Green Party tradition cut its teeth. They stood for human rights across borders and didn't take a position in either camp. And I think this resolution violates that. And then there's the socialist tradition of international working class solidarity. We side with the oppressed. We side with oppressed nations against oppressor nations, against imperialists. And here we have an invasion of Russia, by Russia, of Ukraine. So I hope people will keep those things in mind. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot more discussion on it. But, I was really glad we could get Yuliya on today, given that vote coming up. And we'll have more discussion in the future. So thank you for being here this week, and we'll see you next week and in future weeks.
Thank you so much.